I've spent a lot of time in my life studying Leetcode and trying to figure out new and different and more effective ways of doing it. As a little recap, I spent probably about a year doing it in 2020 with the goal of getting into big tech companies. But now I'm on a new mission to study even more Leetcode. And today I wanted to go through my entire new process for studying. So I think to start, it makes sense to cover how I used to do everything and the improvements I made upon it. Skip ahead if this isn't important to you or if you don't really care, but I feel like it's important to really show like where I came from and how I developed each of my steps, rather than just plastering a whole bunch of steps without any real reason as to why. So the first thing, when I probably started studying Leetcode style questions in 2016 when I graduated from college, was that I would just do random questions. I would just do any random Leetcode question. I would try to figure out, do I know how to do this? And if I didn't, I would just look at the answer, be kind of confused, kind of get it, and then just never look at that question ever again and to consider it completely done. But over time, I realized that when it was time to interview or when it was time to do a lot of these online assessments, I would recognize a lot of these questions, or at least very similar questions to the ones I did in my regular preparation. And I would just have no idea about how to even get started with them. And it'll be a very frustrating experience because I've seen them, I've done them, and I should know how to do them. So in my 2020 study process, I made it my goal to figure out what the best way to study was. And to do that, I went online and looked at all of these other people who were successfully studied and went into big tech companies and tried to really break apart their processes. The main thing was that people would record the time they took to study everything, and they would repeat questions that they were confused with and make sure that they were writing everything down in a systematic way so that they knew, which questions they've already covered. And so that is exactly what I tried to do. This was my first spreadsheet for studying Leetcode questions. I've shown it off a few times in this channel already, but basically it's just a simple list of every single question I ever done, sorted by the different platforms I did it on, how long they took, what the exact date I solved them was, and maybe some lessons learned on it. But if you look at this whole list, there's probably hundreds and hundreds of questions here. The main problem was that there was no way for me to easily sort through these questions and figure out which ones were actually the most difficult for me. I just kind of had to look at it, look at the dates, figure out like how long I took for each question, and then try to do it again. And the other thing was that I never really had any systematic way of reviewing these questions. I would just kind of try to write down my lessons learned from it and maybe reference it in the future or something like that. But the truth was that I would never look at my notes ever again. I would write down these questions, I would redo them if I thought they were difficult, but I would never look at my notes. And that was one big problem that I tried really hard to fix in this Leetcode studying process. So what I've been trying to focus on now for my new studying process is to focus on 3 core pillars. The first is pattern recognition, the second is spaced repetition, and the third is active recall. So with all that being said, this is my Notion Leetcode spreadsheet, and it implements basically all of the different methods that I was talking about earlier. Active recall, spaced repetition, and the ability to look at how long each question takes and repeat them as needed. Let's start with the pattern recognition part. This is where it's important to recognize exactly which data structure and algorithm you need to apply to every single problem. And in the past, I would do this by, reading through Cracking the Coding interview and reading through elements of programming interviews in Python and stuff like that. And they would basically label each section by the data structure used and give you probably a couple dozen questions for each type. And that worked pretty well, but this time I decided to try something a little bit different. This time I've been using the Leetcode 150 to help me really analyze the patterns behind every question. And the Leetcode 150 actually has a couple of main benefits over using books like Cracking the Coding interview, which is basically that for array type of problems, they break them down into very granular different types, like sliding window, 2-pointers, arrays and hashing, binary search. These are all technically just array questions, but these are all different types of ways to tackle questions that are monumentally important in interviews that really need to be drilled down. So I've been using this to really recognize which type of questions require which kinds of tools. And the second thing is spaced repetition. So spaced repetition is basically what I was doing earlier with my spreadsheet of trying to repeat questions over and over, but at specific intervals. The idea behind this is that your brain learns more every time you repeat a difficult concept, but the time between repeating a question has to be short enough that you wouldn't have completely forgotten the concept, and long enough so that you won't just be memorizing the difficult concept you're trying to repeat. Now, in terms of the spaced repetition part, basically for my current spreadsheet, I add questions to the end of the spreadsheet and I never delete them. The reason for this being is I can see exactly the history of every question I've done. So if I pull up an example that I struggle with very hard, it's a 2D dynamic programming question called interleaving strings. You can see that, first of all, I have my notes, my questions and answers are active recall. And I have every single time I've tried to do this question, when I completed it, how long it took, and whether or not I struggled with it, denoted by this check mark here. So you can see for this question, I've done it many times, separated by many days, and I've struggled with it very, very hard. This has been a very difficult question for me to understand. But you can see that the time taken has generally decreased, and you can see the average summation at the bottom. But basically the idea here is that generally when I'm doing my Leetcode question, I try to spend probably like 30 minutes every day in my sessions just trying to review a couple of concepts that were difficult for me in the past, and making sure that the questions have to have been done at least 3 days ago. Because if I repeat a question that was done yesterday, there's a possibility that I'm just memorizing the solution. But the last pillar I use is active recall. So active recall is basically that our brains learn better when we are retrieving information from it, from our long-term memory, rather than just looking at different types of text and trying to memorize it into our brain. What I was doing before with my old spreadsheet was I was just writing notes on every problem that I would either never read, or I would look at it and tell myself that I understood, and then, in reality I didn't. So if you look at this, my notes are basically organized in a fashion where I ask myself questions and then I give myself answers for each question. So if we look at this question, group anagrams, you see I've written for myself a note that says, what is the benefit of a character array versus a character dictionary to count all the occurrences of a character in a string? And to the right of it, I have the answer. So basically what I do now is if I'm repeating a question that I struggled with a while ago and I really can't get it, I reference my own notes with the questions first. And I try to retrieve the information from my brain to see if I can remember the trick or remember like what I need to do for the question. And if I can't get it, then I look at the answer and I try to redo that question again. And this has been beneficial for me because it just makes it so that I'm conserving a lot of this time that I used, trying to understand a Leetcode question and instead writing it down so I can use it later. So again, spaced repetition, active recall, and pattern recognition. Those are the things I use to study Leetcode nowadays. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit at the end talking about like whether or not all this is really necessary, because I know a lot of people are out there looking for software jobs and struggling and figuring out like, do they need to grind hundreds and hundreds of questions and everything like that? The answer is probably not. For me, I'm trying to do Leetcode because one, I'm trying to make myself the best candidate possible. The second reason is that there are times where I actually enjoy Leetcode a lot. They're kind of like puzzles, and every time you finish a puzzle or you complete one, you get a small endorphin rush. And the third reason is that Leetcode actually, for me, does help me to refresh a lot of my coding skills. Even though a lot of these data structures and algorithms aren't going to be used on the actual job, it helps me to retrieve these different concepts of how to approach and break down difficult programming concepts. And for me, I've been supplementing Leetcode with system design, with building my own side projects in this journey back into software. So for you, I would like to give a pretty interesting statistic in that I've probably interviewed and been interviewed probably 50 plus times in my life. And the amount of times that I've actually encountered a company that asks Leetcode questions is probably maybe a little bit more than half the interviews. And they were generally not very difficult unless you were interviewing at Google or Facebook or Microsoft or something like that. So in general, it's not something where you need to go ahead and apply all of this stuff that I mentioned and optimize your Leetcode studying strategy and do 500 questions and stuff like that. It's more of just a way of using it to be efficient with your time and be able to help and track what you've done and to not waste a lot of the time you spent trying to understand questions. Anyways, that's it for today. As always, thanks for watching.